Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I am actually going to finish up Chapter 17 from the Absorbent Mind. Now, for some of you who have been following me for a long time, you know that Part 4 came out over a year ago, so this Part 5 has been in the works for a while, and I just haven't gotten around to it because there are more demands on my channel for material videos. More people want the how-to videos on lesson materials, so I really started to focus more on that, but I have had people asking me to finish the Absorbent Mind series, so I'm going to try and pick that back up again. I'm going to try and get through the Absorbent Mind, and I also want to be able to go through that pamphlet from Mario Montessori on the human tendencies. So I am going to try and get back into some theory. And I know I also started a series on the classroom observations and scientific observations in Montessori, and that will come back into play as well. But I know that's not as popular as some of my other video topics. So I really am trying to balance out what people are asking of me, and I'm trying to make sure that I'm giving enough of a variety of videos that help everyone from a homeschool environment to going through AMI training. So bear with me if it feels like I'm bouncing between subjects just a little bit, because I do want to prioritize the needs that are presented to me in the comment section and the emails that I get. So I am trying to respond to as many people as possible in terms of what you're asking me to do and what you're asking to learn. So with that being said, let's jump into Chapter 17, Part 5. And Chapter 17 is titled Further Elaboration Through Culture and Imagination. And I took this chapter out of order. Some of you might remember, it's been a while, but you might remember that I said I was going to take this chapter out of order because I really wanted to talk about all the different themes in this chapter, and that caused me to bounce around just a little bit. So in this particular video, we're going to get into more of the culture, the social groups, the human tendencies that she's talking about in this chapter, which are some pretty big subjects, which can also be hot topics to talk about. And I'm going to try and navigate my way through this as gently as possible so that everybody can think critically about what she's saying in this chapter. So just to review, I did divide Chapter 17 into 5 different parts. And the first video was an introduction, and we talked about exploring the laws of nature. And then in the second video, I talked more about imagination. The third video was about language and practical life. And then the fourth video, which was, I believe, a little over a year ago, was about sensorial and math. Now we're getting to this fifth video, this final video of Chapter 17 from the Absorbent Mind. And we're going to talk about social groups. We're going to talk about the human tendencies, and we're going to talk about community in this video. And I'm going to try and pose some very thought-provoking comments in this video. So let's talk about social groups. And when we talk about this topic, we're going to be touching on some topics like evolution, morals, and religion. Now, these are not easy topics to cover these days. It's easy to get offended. So my goal in going through some of these topics is really to pose more questions, more ideas to you so that you can think critically and interpret this for yourself. I'm not going to go into a lot of my belief system, but I am going to talk about what Montessori brought up, and I'm going to ask you to reflect on it. So just keep that in mind, that this video is really meant for your reflection as we go through this, and not so much about my opinions. So when we're talking about the issues in this chapter, we're really going to be hitting on this topic of nature versus nurture, right? What we are born with, and then what do we do in response to what we are born with, right? What happens after that birth, that experience of biology and the formation of the mind, the formation of the body, right? We're born into we're born into this world in a certain way, and that has some effects, that has some predetermined effects. And then also we have this idea of nurture. And on top of that, Montessori proposed the idea of human tendencies. And if you're not familiar with human tendencies, I do have a video on it already. But just to give you the basic reminder or the basic idea of human tendencies, Montessori believed that humans were different than the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom is born with instincts, right? They're born with instincts, but humans are different. Humans are born with tendencies. And in this chapter, we're going to go over this idea of how humans are a little bit different. And that's going to get into that idea of human tendencies. And I will try to make a note to link down below to the topics I have on human tendencies on my channel already, so that if you need a review of that or if you need to learn that for the first time, I'm going to make that available to you as well. So let's start out on page 162 in the Absorbent Mind. We're going to talk about the construction of personality. And on this page, Montessori says, hence the period under 6 is decisive. Whatever abilities the child constructs then will remain incarnate in him for life. His ways of moving and of doing things become fixed and permanent features of his personality. Because of this, a man of lowly birth, should altered circumstances cause him to move in a higher sphere, will be unable to throw off the stigma of his origin. And if an aristocrat wishes to disguise himself as a working man, something in his manner and habits is sure to betray him. So let's think about this for a second, and I want to pose the question, do you agree with this? First of all, is this something that you believe? Is it something you agree with? Or is it something that you disagree with Montessori about? And why or why not? And when we think about this, we're really talking about that 0 to 6 age group, right? That is what she's talking about here, this absorbent mind, this time period where the child absorbs everything, is incredibly delicate, incredibly important. And once that child has those experiences in the first 6 years, it sets this foundation. And that framework is established in the first 6 years, according to Montessori. So what she's saying here isn't that you are born into a certain class system and you can never move. That's not what she's saying here. But what she's saying is this is going to have an effect on your life that you're going to carry with you. Right? If we have somebody who is born from the royal family for the first 6 years of their life, then that is going to affect how they approach the world or how they interact with the world for the rest of their life. And the same might be said of somebody who is born in Appalachia. If you're born into poverty in a certain area of a certain country versus somebody who's born into royalty in a certain country, those first 6 years of your life are going to look very different. And you may eventually in your life all end up leading a country. But you're not going to be able to hide that framework in those first 6 years of your life. So that's just something to think about here. It's not that you are born into a class system that you can't move out of, but it is going to affect how you interact with the world even as an adult. Now let's move on to page 167. Montessori here is going to talk a little bit about evolution. And she says other things besides language also are established by social groups. For example, habits and customs which finally become imbued with the force of morals. It is interesting to note that these customs seldom arise merely to make life easier, as used to be maintained in evolutionary theory. Social rules have aspects which are more contradictory than otherwise to this idea. The instinct of self-preservation does not merely seek out the best conditions of life. On the contrary, restrictions of life appear, which make one think rather of an inborn instinct of sacrifice. The facts are that studies of the customs of primitive peoples show that restrictive practices and even bodily mutilations occur in all of them. She goes on to talk about how beauty itself is sometimes sought in the shape of unnatural distortions, which are often inflicted at the cost of a heavy sacrifice. And she gives the example in the book on page 168, she gives the example of stunting Chinese women's feet. Or maybe more common would be the perforations of the ear or nose for wearing jewelry. And of course, the deformations that can come of wearing jewelry that we can see in different different customs in different areas of the world. The ideas that evolution brought forward are often contradicted when it comes to the human species. And that's what she's getting at here. And if you're not quite understanding what I'm saying in this particular passage, we're going to go a little deeper into it. So let's talk about page 168. She's going to talk about belief systems versus survival. And I gave the example from the book where she was talking about stunting a feet and deforming your body to wear jewelry. But on page 168, Montessori says that the most important restrictions occur in diet. Now remember, this book was written a long time ago, and she says those millions of Indians, people from India, who recently died of famine lived in a land of flocks and herds, as prolific as anywhere in the world. But so deeply ingrained was their custom of not slaughtering animals for food that this habit was stronger than death. So she's saying here that this idea of morals, of what is happening in that social group, in that community, it was more important to abide by things that cost them their life, that cost them sacrifice, than to act in the instinct of self-preservation. And I made a note here that says Montessori further elaborates on this idea in the context of religion and morals in the following paragraph. So make sure to go back and read that. And I'm just going to sum up by saying she explains how these abstracts bring unity to groups of people. And that sets different groups of people apart, and it brings together a sense of unity. So let's take a moment to reflect on everything that I just said, because this topic really takes some critical thinking. And we're not all going to come to the same conclusion. So how do we approach this? How do we approach this subject in terms of how it affects our belief system individually? So Montessori, she's talked about the survival of the most vulnerable. And she's talked about this before. And sometimes humans act in contradiction of that survival of the fittest mentality that was brought to us with the idea of evolution. And she's also talked about how we sacrifice for the survival of the weakest or the most vulnerable. Humans do that. We do things that don't always seem to complement this idea of self-preservation or of survival of the fittest. For humans to survive, the weakest and most vulnerable among us, for instance, children, must survive. They must be protected. Montessori occasionally questions how that fits into evolutionary theory, and also questions how humans can adopt belief systems which contradict survival instincts. So we can't predict which child will grow up to be physically strong or intellectually gifted. So how does the idea of survival of the fittest apply to the needs and the development of children? Is this an outdated idea, or does it still have value? Right? I'm gonna pose those questions out to you right now. And these are really, really big ethical questions I'm asking here. So with that being said, in what way can social groups behave in an anti-human way, a way that goes against the preservation of their species? In what ways can social groups act in a way that is destructive to their future? For humans to survive, we have to protect the weakest. We have to protect the children. We have to protect our most vulnerable. Let's move on to page 169, where she talks about fixed patterns of behavior. She says the child does not at first absorb the actual mental riches of his race, but only the patterns which result from them. He absorbs the basic or summarized part, the precise part, which is repeated in the habitual life of the people. He absorbs, in short, the mathematical part. And once the patterns have become established within him, they remain as fixed characters, just like the mother tongue, just like learning language. The human mind is built up on a basis which is itself creative, but in the period which follows birth, For the mind of man has to fashion itself on what it takes from the outer world. So again, we have this framework, almost a mathematical framework that is provided to the child between the ages of 0 and 6. But the human mind is built up on a basis which is itself creative. You know, that period following birth is a creative period. And again, it's not just about nature, what you're born with, but nurture, right? We've got both of these ideas going on here, and that leaves a lot of room for the creativity. And whatever that child experiences, they are going to absorb it. They need to take from the outside world. So whatever influences come from the outside world make a huge difference in development. On page 171, she talks about adapting to the world, because this is the child's true biological function. The continuity of anything which nature has not fixed, but which evolves gradually as a social pattern must do, is only possible if the new individuals born into it have creative power, one which can adapt them to the circumstances into which they are born. So keep in mind this idea of creativity here, right? It's not just you are born into a class system, you're born into a fixed pattern because of what you experience around you, but there's something creative here going on within the child, right? What the child does with what they are experiencing is really important. And that is what's going to lead to the child's success. The child's success depends on the ability to adapt to the world. This is done by giving the child creative power. The idea of creative power sometimes does not get interpreted correctly within society. And so I want to be really careful about putting this idea of creative power out for the child, because there are rules to follow. And there are a lot of Montessori teachers out there that do not understand these rules. And they tend to swing one direction or another in extreme ways. So let's go through these rules. We're going to give the child creative power through providing opportunities for the hands to acquire skills and explore the environment in an age-appropriate way, right? You're not letting your 2-year-old go out and chop tomatoes with a big, huge butcher knife, right? That's inappropriate. But you might have them butter a cracker with a nice, safe butter knife. So we're looking for opportunities for their hands to acquire skills in an age-appropriate way, in a developmentally appropriate way. The second rule is we need to provide real experiences instead of fantasy or pretend. And I know this goes against everything that our culture seems to be embracing right now. My background before Montessori is early childhood education, and I had dramatic play in my classrooms. I had dress up in my classrooms. Everything was fantasy based. Everything was pretend based. And I want you to step back from that idea real quick, because we need to provide children real experiences. And as long as we're doing that in a developmentally appropriate way, in an age appropriate way, in a safe way, this is first of all going to help the child acquire more skills, acquire more abilities. And not only that, it's going to fulfill them more than if they were pretending. When they are pretending to make you food, guess what? The inner desire of that child is not to pretend. It's to really bring you food, to prepare something for you. When they are pretending to clean the house, guess what? They're not really wanting to pretend. They actually want to do the work with you. And if they're actually doing the work, what are we doing? We're giving them hands-on skills, hands-on development, the coordination and the control of movement, which is going to help them later on in life when they're looking to get jobs that require the ability to coordinate movement. And the third rule is provide satisfactory conditions of life. And think of that in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Those basic needs down at the bottom of the pyramid, those have to come first before we can work our way up to self-actualization. And the fourth rule, which I have talked about in other videos, is we can't place obstacles to development in the child's path. Sometimes the obstacles that we place in children's paths come from a good place, right? We're not all just out there looking to put harmful experiences into our children's lives, into our students' lives. Usually when we place an obstacle in a child's path, it's usually coming from a good place, a protective place. Again, only allowing your child to have pretend experiences or fantasy experiences is an obstacle. That maybe you are doing that because your belief is that it's safer for them. You know, you don't really want them touching butter. You don't really want them touching food. You don't want them working with breakable things. Where the Montessori environment, we know that when something breaks, that's a consequence to the child, right? There's a control of error in that tells us, okay, I did something wrong here. I wasn't gentle enough with this object and now it's broken and I have a real consequence of now I've lost something that's important to me, right? Working with beautiful things, working with breakable things so that children understand consequences, right? If you only give them sippy cups that they can throw against a wall whenever they're mad and there's no consequence for that behavior, that's putting an obstacle in a child's path. And it comes from a good place, right? Having a sippy cup is a lot easier on you, the parent, and you don't have to worry about it breaking. You can take it places, right? There's a lot of good things that come out of having a plastic sippy cup, but it can also become an obstacle if you never give them the opportunity to drink out of a glass. We really want to make sure that we are providing things in our environment that do have consequence, because without consequences, we're putting obstacles in the child's path of development. And I think we're seeing that a lot in our culture, in our society right now. So the fifth rule that we need to follow in giving the child creative power is allowing for the discovery of the human soul. Humans are spiritual, right? And spirituality is part of growing and developing. And then the sixth rule is supporting choice or freedom for the child to explore. And again, this is something that can go drastically wrong when a Montessori guide or Montessori teacher doesn't really understand the concept of what we're saying here. So let's be specific. If the idea of freedom is going to work, the environment must be constructed in a way to provide only good and safe choices for the child. There are a lot of things you can do with consequence. There are a lot of things that you can do with breakable materials. There are a lot of things that the child can experience that are not pretend, that are good and safe. And those things help develop the body. They help develop the control and coordination of movement. They help develop the mind and connect it with the body. So we want to put all good choices into our environment, because if we put all good choices into the environment, the child has the freedom to only make good choices. And so this brings me to the next point. We have to set boundaries. We have to set limits on the environment. The limits on the environment will expand and grow with the child. And so the things that we show the child at 3 years old are very limited because they have very limited abilities. And so their freedom is very limited. But the more abilities that the child develops, the more skills the child develops, the more freedom they get to experience, right? As they are gaining more skills, they gain more self-discipline. And with that discipline and with those abilities comes freedom. The ability to make good choices and the ability to actually do good choices. Because maybe the children can make a good choice mentally, but you haven't taught them the skills to do it through control and coordination of their body. And so you have to have not only the mindset to make good decisions, but you have to have the skills and ability to follow through with those good decisions. And that is what's going to create freedom for the child. And this is what it means by creative power for the child. It's not militaristic. It's not a teacher controlling every little aspect of the student's choices. Nor is it do whatever you want, there's no consequence for your behavior, and no limits, no boundaries, right? Those are the two extremes. And if you're going to get Montessori right, you got to come to the middle. You got to have common sense. Common sense. It's amazing how common sense is lacking these days. And if you just put common sense into your environment, I'm sure that you're going to be following through with all of these rules that come with giving the child creative power. It's when we lose that common sense that everything starts going out of control. So anyways, that is the final section in chapter 17. I know it's been a long time coming, but we are finally finishing chapter 17, and now I can start working on chapter 18. But it's really important that you go back and read each chapter because there's so much more in there, and it's hard for me to leave out so much of the book, but I try to do my best with these summaries of the chapters. So with that being said, that's all I have for you today. I hope this has been helpful. If it has, don't forget to give this video a like. Press that like button. Share this video with somebody who needs it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.